The rescue and the reckoning. The Montana sun hung low in the afternoon sky, turning the dust on Main Street to copper. Daniel Hartwell stood outside Jenkins General Store, one hand resting on the hitching post, the other holding the supply list he'd just filled. At 32 years old, he had the weathered look of a man who'd lived hard and earned every scar. His blue eyes, the color of winter ice, scanned the street with the automatic vigilance of a former soldier. It was August 1876, and Silverton was bustling with the usual chaos of a mining town. Prospectors stumbled from saloons, their pockets heavy with silver or empty with desperation. Merchants hawked their wares. Somewhere down the street, a piano played badly. The air smelled of horse manure, sawdust, and the peculiar metallic tang that came from the mines. Dan had just loaded the last sack of grain into his wagon when he heard the commotion. "Someone help, there's a woman." The voice came from old Mrs. Patterson, standing near the boardwalk with both hands pressed to her mouth. Dan's body moved before his mind finished processing the words. 6 years of ranching hadn't erased the reflexes drilled into him during the war. He crossed the distance in long, purposeful strides, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. A young woman was falling. Dan caught her before she hit the rough boards, his arms closing around a frame so slight it shocked him. She was light as a bird, all bones and faded fabric. Her traveling dress, once fashionable by Eastern standards, hung on her like a shroud. Through the cloth, he could feel her ribs could count them if he'd wanted to. Her head lolled against his chest, revealing a face pale beneath sun-flushed cheeks. Pretty, he noted distantly, in the way a man notices the sky or the grass. But more than that, hungry. "Is she dead?" A boy of maybe 10 pushed forward, eyes wide with morbid curiosity. Dan adjusted his hold, feeling the faint rise and fall of her breathing. "No, just fainted." "Probably the heat," someone offered. Mrs. Patterson shook her head, her expression knowing. "More likely hunger. Look at her. Thin as a rail. Probably hasn't eaten since she got off that stage." Dan had seen starvation before. In the war during the siege at Vicksburg, men had died slowly from lack of food while rats grew fat. The memory sat bitter in his mouth. This woman, whoever she was, had that same hollow-eyed look, that same fragility that came from the body consuming itself. "I'll take her to Ruth's," he said, not asking permission from anyone. He repositioned the woman in his arms, cradling her against his chest as he would an injured calf. Her valise had tumbled from her fingers, spilling a few modest possessions onto the dusty boards. A book, a hairbrush, a tintype photograph of people he didn't recognize. Someone gathered them up as Dan started walking. The woman's head rested against his shoulder. Her breath was warm even through his cotton shirt. She smelled faintly of lavender and train smoke, a strange combination that marked her as someone from away. Someone running towards Silverton, or running from somewhere else. Ruth Morrison's cafe sat at the end of Main Street, a squat building with check curtains and the best food in town. Ruth herself looked up when Dan shouldered through the door, her plump face registering surprise and then understanding in the space of a heartbeat. "Lord have mercy," she said, already moving toward them. "What happened?" "Fainted outside Jenkins' place." Dan maneuvered between the tables to his usual corner booth, the one with a view of the door. Old habits. "Reckon she needs food more than doctoring." Ruth folded a clean tablecloth to make a pillow as Dan laid the woman gently on the bench. Up close, he could see more details. Chestnut hair escaping from pins. A small mole near her left ear. Hands that were soft but red raw, suggesting recent manual work they weren't accustomed to. She wore a thin gold ring on her right hand, not her left. Unmarried then or widowed. "Poor thing," Ruth murmured, studying the woman's face. "New in town, I'd guess from the look of her." "Just off the stage." Dan stepped back, suddenly aware of how improper this all was. He was an unmarried man holding an unconscious woman in a public establishment. Not that Silverton cared much for Eastern propriety, but still. "Her things are still on the boardwalk. I should fetch them." "You do that. I'll put coffee on and heat up today's stew." When Dan returned with the valise, the woman was beginning to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of sage in summer. Gray-green and sharp even in confusion. She blinked at the unfamiliar surroundings, then startled when she noticed Dan standing near the table. "Please don't be alarmed, miss." He set the valise carefully on the floor. "You fainted out on this boardwalk. I brought you here." Ruth's Cafe. Safe place. The woman pushed herself upright, color flooding her cheeks. Not from health, Dan noted, but from shame. Pride was written all over her in the way she straightened her spine despite obvious weakness, in how her chin lifted even as her hands trembled. I don't know what to say. Her voice was refined, educated with the clipped consonants of New England. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell, Daniel Hartwell. Most folks call me Dan. Margaret Brennan. She extended a shaking hand, which he took briefly. Her palm was damp, her grip weak. Most people call me Maggie. I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience. No inconvenience at all. Dan slid onto the bench across from her, keeping a respectful distance. Happens more than you'd think. Journey to Silverton isn't easy. Ruth appeared with a steaming cup of coffee and a bowl of beef stew, the aroma so rich it made Dan's own mouth water. Maggie stared at the food with naked longing that she tried to hide behind manners. I'm afraid I haven't yet. Her voice trailed off. Dan understood immediately. No money, or too little to spare on food. He'd been there himself once in the months after the war, when pride was all a man had left. It's on me, he said firmly. Consider it a welcome to Silverton. Pride and hunger warred on her face. Hunger won. She took up the spoon with as much dignity as she could muster, taking a small, careful bite. Then another, less restrained. By the third spoonful, her composure was cracking, revealing the desperate edge of real starvation. Dan signaled Ruth for a basket of bread, which Maggie accepted with grateful eyes that said more than words ever could. So, Miss Brennan, Dan said after she'd eaten enough to take the edge off, what brings you to our corner of Montana? Maggie dabbed at her mouth with a napkin, trying to recover some semblance of propriety. I've come to teach at the school. There was an advertisement in the Boston papers. The town council was seeking someone with proper educational credentials. Dan's eyebrows rose slightly. That would be Abner Whitmore's doing. The mayor had been trying to get a real school going for the past year. Most mining towns didn't bother much with education, but Silverton was starting to put down permanent roots. People were building houses instead of tents, planning futures instead of just chasing silver. And you, Mr. Hartwell, Maggie's gaze was direct, assessing. What do you do here? I run a ranch, the Double H, about 5 miles east of town. Started with 20 head of cattle 6 years ago. Got closer to 500 now. Dan watched her take this in, saw her eyes flick to his left hand where the last 2 fingers were missing. He waited for the question, but it didn't come. Instead, she asked about the ranch, about the land, about how a person built something from nothing in this territory. They talked for the better part of an hour. Maggie's hunger gradually satisfied her core, improving with each bite. She was intelligent, Dan realized. Quick-minded. She listened more than she spoke, a rare quality. When she did talk, her words were measured, thoughtful. She asked about Silverton's history, about the mines, about the school she'd be teaching at. How old is your ranch? She asked at one point. 6 years, give or take. Came out here in '70 after the war. Lot of us did, looking for something new. The war. Her eyes drifted again to his hand. Dan gave a small, tight smile. Antietam, I was just 17. Lied about my age to enlist. He paused, then added what he rarely told anyone. Thought I was going to save the Union. Ended up just trying to stay alive. Maggie's expression softened. I'm sorry. Long time ago. And I fared better than many. He shifted, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Sympathy from a woman he barely knew felt too intimate, too close to pity. You know where you're staying? The letter from the town council mentioned lodgings at Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house. Dan nodded. Emma Wilcox runs a respectable place 2 streets over. Mostly teachers and unmarried shopkeepers stay there. He stood pulling coins from his pocket to leave on the table for Ruth. I should probably show you to Mayor Whitmore's office, then help you get settled at Emma's, if that's all right with you. Maggie hesitated only briefly before nodding. That would be most appreciated. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, the afternoon had shifted toward evening. The street was busier now, miners emerging from their shifts, merchants closing up shops. Dan carried her valise, ignoring the curious looks from townspeople who knew him as a man who kept to himself. I truly am grateful, Maggie said as they walked. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Someone would have helped, Dan replied with a shrug. Folks here look out for each other, half to this far from civilization. Is that how you see it, as being away from civilization? Dan glanced down at her. Aren't we? No symphony orchestras or fancy theaters out here. No paved streets or gas lamps. No, Maggie agreed. But there are other kinds of civilization. Community, neighborliness, the things you just described, people looking out for one another. That seems more civilized than some of what passes for society back east. Dan studied her with new interest. Maybe this Boston teacher would do all right in Silverton after all. Most Eastern folks came west expecting to civilize the territory to bring their refinement to the wilderness. This one seemed to understand that civilization wasn't about parlors and calling cards. Mayor Whitmore's office sat above the Silverton Miners Bank, reached by a narrow staircase that smelled of cigar smoke and old paper. The mayor himself was a portly man in his 50s with mutton chop whiskers and an enthusiastic handshake that made Maggie wince. Miss Brennan, we'd almost given up hope. He pumped her hand vigorously. Your last letter said you'd arrived 2 weeks ago. Maggie withdrew her hand with polite firmness. There were delays with the railroad, and then the stagecoach broke an axle near Helena. I do apologize for any inconvenience. No, the important thing is you're here now. Whitmore beamed at her, then noticed Dan standing quietly by the door. Ah, Hartwell. Good to see you. Bringing our new school teacher to meet me, I see. Miss Brennan had a bit of trouble when she arrived, Dan explained simply, helping her get oriented. Whitmore nodded, missing the significance entirely. He launched into a detailed explanation of the school situation, the building ready but awaiting supplies, the 30 students already enrolled ages 6 to 16. As he talked, Dan's attention drifted to the desk behind the mayor. Land survey maps lay spread across the surface corners, weighted with books. Dan could make out property lines, claim markers, the familiar shape of his own spread marked in careful ink. But there were other markings too in a different hand. New claim lines that cut across established boundaries. And a name he recognized, Victor Blackwood. Whitmore noticed Dan's gaze and quickly moved to cover the maps with other papers. Just reviewing some land office business, he said too casually. Nothing to concern yourself with. But Dan's instincts, honed by years of watching for threats, told him otherwise. Something was wrong. He filed the information away, a seed of worry planted deep. After finalizing Maggie's salary and start date, Dan escorted her to Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house. The 2-story clapboard building stood white and neat, a stark contrast to the rougher structures dominating Silverton. Mrs. Wilcox herself answered their knock, a thin, straight-backed woman whose severe appearance was softened by kind eyes. You must be Miss Brennan, she said, opening the door wider. We'd begun to worry. As Maggie explained about the delays, Dan set her valise inside the tidy parlor. Mrs. Wilcox's eyebrows rose slightly when she noticed him. Mr. Hartwell, she said, her tone somewhere between surprise and approval. Rare to see you in town at this hour. Had business, Dan replied. Miss Brennan needed help. Mrs. Wilcox's expression suggested she understood more than Dan had said. You've always been helpful, like your father. The mention of his father sent a familiar ache through Dan's chest. Thomas Hartwell had been dead 6 years, but the weight of his legacy never lightened. I'll leave you in Mrs. Wilcox's capable hands, Dan said to Maggie, touching the brim of his hat. If you need anything, Ruth at the cafe usually knows where to find me when I'm in town. Thank you again, Maggie said warmly, for everything. Something passed between them, then a moment of connection that surprised them both. Dan nodded once and departed, his mind already turning to the ranch, to the work waiting, and to those maps in Whitmore's office. The 5-mile ride to the Double H Ranch gave Dan time to think. The wagon rolled over familiar ruts, the horses knowing the way by heart. Around him, the Montana landscape stretched vast and indifferent. Mountains rose to the west, their peaks already touched with early snow. The valley where his ranch sat was sheltered, good water, good grass. His father had chosen well. Thomas Hartwell, soldier, pioneer, dead man. Dan's hands tightened on the reins as memories surfaced unbidden. His father had been a Union veteran like himself, wounded at Shiloh and sent home to die slowly. But Thomas Hartwell hadn't died. He'd recovered enough to hear about the Homestead Act, about free land out west for those willing to claim it and work it. In 1807, with Dan still fighting in the war, Thomas had traveled to Montana Territory and filed a claim on 160 acres of what would become the Double H. But the wound from Shiloh had never truly healed. In 1870, infection set in. Thomas died before he could complete the legal paperwork for the homestead, before he could prove his 5 years of continuous residence and improvement. He'd left Dan a letter, a land claim map, and the ranch itself half-built and legally uncertain. Build something that lasts, the letter had said. Make the sacrifice worth it. Dan had tried. For 6 years, he'd poured everything into the ranch. 20 cattle had become 500. A rough cabin had become a solid timber house with 4 bedrooms and glass windows. He'd hired Carlos Martinez as foreman, employed hands during roundup, built barns and corrals and fences. The Double H was successful by any measure, but he'd never gone back to the land office to complete his father's claim. He'd assumed that living on the land, improving it, working it for 6 years, made it his by right. The law he was about to learn cared less about right than about paperwork. Carlos was waiting when Dan pulled the wagon up to the barn. Carlos Martinez was 38, a fellow veteran who'd fought for the Union, despite being Mexican, despite facing prejudice from both sides. He was lean and hard with a scar across his left cheek and eyes that missed nothing. "How was town?" Carlos asked in Spanish, his preferred language when they were alone. "Met the new school teacher," Dan replied in the same language. His Spanish was rough, but serviceable. "She'll do fine," Carlos grinned. "She interesting?" Dan ignored the implication. "Where's the boy?" "In the barn, working on that saddle like you showed him." Samuel Hartwell emerged as if summoned, a boy of 10, with serious dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Sam was Dan's nephew, the son of Dan's younger brother, who died of fever 2 years back. The boy's mother had died in childbirth, leaving Sam alone in the world until Dan brought him to the ranch a year ago. "Uncle Dan." Sam's greeting was quiet, reserved. The boy had learned early that loud voices brought trouble. "Sam." Dan ruffled the boy's hair, one of the few gestures of affection he allowed himself. "How's that saddle coming?" "Almost done. Carlos says I'm getting better at the stitching." "Good. Man needs to know how to repair his own gear." Dan looked at Carlos. "Everything quiet while I was gone?" "Quiet enough. North fence still needs mending. I'll take Sam tomorrow, teach him proper." Dan nodded approval. Teaching the boy was as much Carlos's job as Dan's. Sam needed to learn the ranch work, needed to understand that survival in Montana meant knowing 100 skills and mastering them all. That evening, as the sun set fire to the western mountains, Dan stood on the porch of his house and looked over his land. 500 head of cattle grazed in the valley. The barn stood solid. The house his father had started and he had finished rose 2 stories, a monument to stubbornness and sweat. Inside, he could hear Sam setting the table while Carlos finished cooking. The boy had taken to ranch life better than Dan had dared hope. He worked hard, complained little, and watched everything with those serious eyes, learning. "Uncle Dan." Sam appeared in the doorway. "Supper's ready." They ate simply beef, beans, bread that Carlos's wife had baked. The 3 of them sat around the table Dan had built himself, and for a moment it felt like family. Not the family Dan had lost, but something new, something worth protecting. "Sam," Dan said as they cleared the plates, "you thinking about school?" The boy looked up, uncertainty crossing his face. "I don't know. I can learn ranch work from you and Carlos." "Ranch work keeps you alive," Dan agreed. "But education makes you free. Your grandfather believed that. So do I." Sam considered this. "If I go to school, I can still help with chores." "Course, school's only during the day. Plenty of work left for evenings." Dan paused. "The new teacher, Miss Brennan, seems capable. I think you'd do well." "All right," Sam agreed. "I'll try it." That night, Dan lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. Sleep came hard, as it often did. His mind kept returning to those maps in Whitmore's office, to the name Victor Blackwood written across land surveys. Blackwood owned half the mines in Silverton, controlled most of the town's money. He was ambitious, ruthless, and apparently interested in expanding his holdings. Dan's land sat adjacent to several of Blackwood's mining claims. Good land, valuable land, land that legally might not belong to Dan at all if someone challenged his claim. The worry that had been a seed began to grow. Sunday morning found Dan in his good suit, a rare concession to respectability. He attended church irregularly, more out of duty than faith. War had beaten most of the religion out of him. But church was where the community gathered, where news spread, where a man learned what currents were moving beneath Silverton's surface. Sam sat beside him, hair slicked down, collar too tight. The boy endured the sermon with visible patience, his attention wandering to the windows where freedom beckoned. Maggie Brennan was there too, Dan noticed. She wore a green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair arranged in a simple style that somehow made her more beautiful than the elaborate fashions other women attempted. She sat with Mrs. Wilcox proper and reserved, but her gaze found his across the church, and she smiled slightly. Dan nodded back, aware of eyes watching the exchange. Small towns notice everything. Victor Blackwood made his entrance late, as was his custom. He was 45, well-fed, with the smooth hands of a man who'd never done real labor. His daughter Victoria clung to his arm, 18, and spoiled her dress far too elaborate for a frontier church. They processed down the aisle like royalty, taking a pew near the front. Blackwood's eyes swept the congregation and landed on Dan. For a moment, the two men held each other's gaze. Blackwood's smile was politician smooth, but his eyes calculated, measured, assessed. Dan stared back without expression until Blackwood looked away first. After the service, as people milled on the church steps exchanging pleasantries, Blackwood approached. Dan had been expecting it, had seen it coming in the way the man maneuvered through the crowd. Hartwell, Blackwood's handshake was firm, practiced. "We need to talk about your land." Dan didn't return the smile. "My land, nothing to talk about." "Actually, there is." Blackwood's voice dropped, became confidential. "I've been reviewing land office records in Helena. Your father filed a claim in '67, but the paperwork was never completed. No proof of improvement filed. No final patent issued." The worry in Dan's gut crystallized into cold certainty. "I've been living on that land for 6 years, built everything from nothing." "Admirable," Blackwood agreed, "but law is law. Without proper title, that land is public domain. And I've filed a new claim on it." Dan's fist clenched at his side. Years of controlling his temper, of swallowing rage, kept his voice level. "You're trying to steal my ranch." "I'm claiming unclaimed land, legally." Blackwood's smile never wavered. "You're welcome to challenge me in court, of course. But we both know how that will go. I have lawyers, connections, resources." He paused. "You have dirt under your fingernails and a boy to feed." Every instinct screamed at Dan to put his fist through that smug face. But he'd learned in the war that rage without strategy was suicide. He unclenched his hand, forced his breathing to steady. "We'll see," was all he said. Blackwood's smile thinned. "Indeed we will. Court date will be set soon. I suggest you use the time to find new accommodations." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Dan standing on the church steps with the world tilting beneath his feet. Carlos appeared at his elbow. Trouble. The worst kind. Dan watched Blackwood climb into his expensive carriage. "He's going after the ranch. Says we don't have legal title." "Can he do that?" "Apparently." Dan's mind raced, sorting through options, finding them all bad. "I need a lawyer, a good one." That afternoon, Dan called a council of war at Ruth's Cafe. Carlos, Ruth, and Dr. Robert Peterson gathered around Dan's corner booth. Dr. Peterson was 62, with white hair and steady hands that had saved more lives than Dan could count. He'd been friends with Thomas. Hartwell had treated the older man's wounds, had watched him die. "Thomas told me about that claim," Peterson said, after Dan explained the situation. "He was too sick to complete the paperwork properly. Meant to finish it when he got better." The old doctor's face creased with regret. "But he never did get better." "What can we do?" Carlos asked. Ruth leaned forward. "Fight it in court. Judge Whitmore is fair." "Whitmore is also mayor," Dan pointed out. "Blackwood owns half the mines in town." "Money talks louder than fairness." "There's a lawyer in Helena," Ruth offered. "Young fellow named Frank Sullivan. Honest, they say. Knows land law." Dan nodded slowly. "I'll ride out tomorrow. See if he'll take the case." "What about payment?" Dr. Peterson asked gently. "Lawyers don't come cheap." Dan had been thinking about that. "I'll sell some cattle if I have to. This is worth everything." As the meeting broke up, Dan found himself walking toward Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house. He told himself it was strategy, that Maggie Brennan was educated and might have insights into legal matters. But part of him, a part he wasn't ready to examine, just wanted to see her again. Mrs. Wilcox answered his knock with knowing eyes. "Mr. Hartwell, Miss Brennan is in the parlor if you'd like to see her." Maggie looked up from a book when he entered, surprise and something else, pleasure, maybe crossing her face. "Dan, this is unexpected." He remained standing, hat in hands. "I need advice. You said your father was a banker. Would he have dealt with land law?" "Some." What's wrong? Dan explained, keeping his voice level, sticking to facts. Maggie listened without interrupting, her sharp mind clearly working through the details. Without proof of improvement, your claim is vulnerable, she said finally. But 6 years of continuous habitation and the improvements you've made that could support a squatter's rights argument. Squatter's rights? Dan hadn't considered that angle. It's called adverse possession in legal terms. If you can prove open, continuous, and notorious possession of land with substantial improvements, some jurisdictions will grant title even without proper filing. She paused. You'd need witnesses, receipts, survey proof. Dan felt the first stirring of hope. I have receipts. Carlos can testify. Ruth can too. Then you have a fighting chance. Maggie's eyes met his. What Blackwood's doing, it's theft dressed in legal language. I don't like bullies. Neither do I. Dan allowed himself a small smile. Thank you, Miss Brennan. Maggie, she corrected. We're allies now, aren't we? Reckon we are. 2 weeks passed. Dan rode to Helena and secured Frank Sullivan's services. The young lawyer was 28, idealistic and angry enough about land grabbers to take the case for reduced fees. School started and Sam enrolled despite his nervousness. Maggie proved to be an excellent teacher, patient but firm, and Sam came home each day with new knowledge that he shared enthusiastically. Dan threw himself into preparing for the court case, gathering every scrap of evidence that might prove his claim. Receipts for lumber nails, cattle purchases, testimony from Carlos, Ruth, Dr. Peterson. A survey he commissioned showing all improvements on the land. It wasn't enough, he knew, but it was something. Then came October 3rd. The explosion shook the ground like an earthquake. Dan was in town buying supplies when the boom rolled across Silverton, followed by a column of black smoke rising from the North Mine. People poured into the streets, shouting, crying. The mine employed 70 men. If the main shaft had collapsed, dozens could be trapped. Dan's war training kicked in. He didn't think, just moved. Carlos, he shouted to his foreman, get medical supplies from the ranch, bandages, whiskey, anything Dr. Peterson might need. Then he was running toward the mine, joining the stream of men racing to help. The scene was chaos. Smoke billowed from the mine entrance. Women screamed for husbands and sons. The mine foreman lay dead, his skull crushed by falling rock. Dr. Peterson was setting up a triage station at the assay office, his face grim. Dan, thank God, I need help organizing this. Tell me what you need. For the next 12 hours, Dan became someone he hadn't been since the war. A leader, a man who could make decisions when others froze. He divided the rescue workers into teams, 5 men digging, 5 men shoring up timbers, rotating every 30 minutes to prevent exhaustion. He organized a water brigade. He set up a signal system, using rope tugs to communicate with men inside the unstable shaft. The technical knowledge came back to him, learned hard in the war. How to judge timber strength, how to calculate the risk of further collapse, how to keep men moving when fear threatened to freeze them. He led 3 separate teams into the shaft himself, each time crawling through darkness, thick with dust and death. They brought out injured men, carried them to daylight, then went back for more. Twice Dan was nearly buried by secondary collapses. Once Carlos pulled him from beneath a falling beam, probably saving his life. Maggie worked at the makeshift hospital with the other women, assisting Dr. Peterson, organizing volunteers, maintaining calm efficiency in the face of horror. Dan saw her once when he brought in a man with a crushed leg. Their eyes met across the chaos and something passed between them. Understanding, respect, the recognition of 2 people doing what needed to be done. By midnight, they'd recovered everyone they could reach. 17 men rescued alive. 8 seriously injured but likely to survive. 5 dead, their bodies carried out with reverence and laid in a row outside the assay office. Dan stood covered in soot and blood, every muscle screaming, and watched the widows identify their husbands. This was the cost of mining, of chasing silver through the earth. These men had died for Blackwood's profit. As if summoned by the thought, Victor Blackwood arrived in his carriage. He surveyed the scene with what might have been genuine concern, though Dan couldn't tell if the man was capable of such emotion. Tragic, Blackwood said to the assembled workers. Truly tragic. The company will, of course, provide compensation to the families. He approached Dan, who stood with Carlos near the mine entrance. Heroic work, Hartwell. The town is in your debt. Dan said nothing. He was too tired for anger, too empty for words. Blackwood leaned closer, his voice dropping. Of course, this doesn't change our legal matter. The court date is set for December 15th. I trust you will have your affairs in order by then. Only Carlos's hand on his arm kept Dan from violence. The Mexican's grip was iron, his voice low and urgent in Spanish. Not worth it, amigo. He wants you to hit him. Witnesses everywhere. Dan exhaled slowly, forcing his fists to unclench. Get off my land, Blackwood. Not your land, Blackwood corrected gently. Not anymore. He tipped his hat and walked away. Ruth appeared with coffee and what remained of the evening's stew. Dan took the cup but couldn't eat. Around him, the town was beginning to process what had happened. Families claimed they're injured. The dead were prepared for burial. Life, brutal and brief, continued. You should rest, Carlos said. We've done all we can. But Dan remained watching the sun rise over Silverton, painting the mountains gold. He thought about his father, about promises made and kept. He thought about Sam, asleep at the ranch, and about the land that might not be his to pass down. He thought about Maggie Brennan working through the night to save lives and about how some people ran toward disaster while others ran away. The seed of worry had become a tree, its roots deep, its branches spreading. In 2 months, he would face Blackwood in court. In 2 months, he might lose everything his father had died to claim everything he'd built with his own hands. But this morning, watching survivors embrace their families, Dan felt something else alongside the worry. Determination. The same stubborn refusal to quit that had carried him through Antietam, through 6 years of backbreaking ranch work, through every hardship the frontier had thrown at him. He would fight, and if he lost, at least he would lose on a heavy, not on his knees. The war had taught him how to survive. The ranch had taught him how to build. Now life was teaching him how to fight for what mattered, not with guns or fists, but with law and community, and the quiet strength of knowing he was in the right. Sam appeared from the direction of town, having ridden in when he heard about the disaster. The boy's face was pale but determined. Uncle Dan, he said simply, and Dan pulled him close, letting the boy feel the reassurance of his presence. It's all right, son. We're all right. And for now, in this moment between disasters, that was enough. The battle for home. Frank Sullivan arrived in Silverton on a cold October morning, riding a bay mare and carrying a leather satchel that contained his entire law practice. At 28, he was young enough to still believe in justice and old enough to know it rarely came without a fight. Dan met him at Ruth's Cafe, the corner booth that had become his unofficial office. Mr. Hartwell, Frank's handshake was firm, his eyes direct. I've reviewed the documents you sent. This is going to be difficult, but it's not impossible. Dan poured coffee from the pot Ruth had left. Tell me straight, what are my chances? Frank spread papers across the table, organizing them with the precision of a man who understood that details mattered. The Homestead Act of 1862 requires 3 things: 5 years of continuous residence, proof of substantial improvement, and proper filing with the land office. You have got the first 2. The third is where Blackwood has you. So I lose. Not necessarily. Frank pulled out a leather-bound law book, flipping to a marked page. There's a doctrine called adverse possession. Montana territory recognizes it. If you can prove open, continuous, and notorious possession of land for 7 years combined with substantial improvements, you can claim title even without proper filing. Dan leaned forward. I've only been there 6 years. You've been there 6 years, but your father filed the original claim in 1867. That's 9 years total of Hartwell possession. Frank tapped the book. The law looks at continuous family occupation. If we can prove your father intended the land for you, that his death was the only reason the paperwork wasn't completed, and that you continued his work in good faith, we have an argument. It was the first real hope Dan had felt since Blackwood's threat. What do you need from me? Everything. Frank pulled out a notebook. Every receipt for materials. Every witness who can testify to your presence on that land. Survey maps showing your improvements. Your father's original claim documents. Letters, photographs, anything that proves continuous occupation and intent. Over the next week, Dan became a man obsessed. He dug through 6 years of accumulated papers, finding receipts for lumber purchased in 1871, nails bought in 1872, cattle acquired in 1873 and 1874 and 1875. He had bills of sale for 2 horses contracts with seasonal workers during Roundup, even a receipt for glass windows shipped from Denver. Carlos provided detailed testimony about working the ranch since 1871. He could describe every building Dan had constructed, every fence line extended, every improvement made. Ruth contributed years of supply bills proving Dan's regular presence in town as a resident, not a transient. Peterson, despite his age and failing health, agreed to testify about treating Dan at the ranch multiple times, establishing continuous habitation. Maggie volunteered to help organize the mountain of paperwork. She arrived at the ranch one Saturday morning with a typewriter borrowed from the school, her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back for work. Dan showed her into the house, suddenly conscious of how bachelor rough it was, clean but sparse, functional not comfortable. "This is quite a place," Maggie said, looking around the main room with its stone fireplace and hand-built furniture. "You made all this yourself?" "Most of it. Carlos helped with some." Dan gestured at the table buried under papers. "Sorry for the mess." "Mess is what I'm here to fix." Maggie sat down and began sorting documents with efficient hands. "I'll organize these chronologically then by category. Receipts in one pile, witness statements in another, legal documents in a third." They worked through the afternoon, Dan providing context while Maggie created order from chaos. She asked sharp questions, noted inconsistencies, suggested ways to strengthen their case. Watching her work, Dan realized she had a mind suited for this kind of detail, this kind of strategic thinking. "Your father," she said at one point, examining his original land claim. "What was he like?" Dan paused in sorting receipts. People rarely asked about Thomas Hartwell. Most folks in Silverton had never known him. "Stubborn, proud, believed in building things that lasted." He smiled slightly. "Guess I got that from him." "And the war wound that killed him?" "Shiloh, 1862. Took a bullet in the gut, survived somehow. But the wound never healed right. Infection came back years later." Dan's voice went flat the way it did when talking about death. "He died hard. Took 2 weeks. By the end, he couldn't even write his own name." Maggie's hand covered his briefly. "I'm sorry. He left me a letter. Said to build something worth the sacrifice." Dan looked out the window at the land spreading before them. "I've tried, but if Blackwood wins, it'll all be for nothing. Then we make sure Blackwood doesn't win." Sam appeared in the doorway, dusty from afternoon chores. He stopped when he saw Maggie, suddenly shy. "Sorry, Uncle Dan. Didn't know you had company." "Sam, this is Miss Brennan, your teacher." "Hello, Sam." Maggie smiled at the boy. "You've been doing excellent work in school. Your reading has improved remarkably." Sam ducked his head, pleased. "Thank you, ma'am." "Why don't you help us?" Maggie suggested. "We're organizing documents. You could sort these receipts by year." The three of them worked together as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Dan found himself watching them, his nephew and this woman from Boston, bent over papers and talking quietly. It felt like something he'd never had before. Not family exactly, but not friendship either. Something new. Something that made the house feel less empty. By evening, they'd created a timeline of Dan's 6 years on the ranch, a visual proof of continuous improvement and investment. Maggie had typed witness statements on official-looking paper. She'd organized receipts into a ledger that showed over $3,000 invested in improvements. "This is good," she said, surveying their work. "This is very good. Any reasonable judge would see you've more than met the spirit of the Homestead Act." "Whitmore's reasonable," Dan agreed, "but he's also politically minded. Blackwood has influence." "Then we give the judge no choice but to rule in your favor." Maggie's eyes were fierce. "We make the evidence so overwhelming that ruling against you would be obvious corruption." Dan drove her back to town as dusk fell, Sam sitting between them on the wagon seat. The boy chattered about school, about the books he was reading, about how Miss Brennan had let him help younger students with their arithmetic. Maggie listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made Sam think. At Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house, Dan helped Maggie down from the wagon. Their hands touched, held a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said, "for today, for all of it. We're fighting the same fight, Dan. I told you I don't like bullies. It's more than that now." Dan surprised himself by admitting it. "You've become important. To Sam, to me." Maggie's eyes searched his face. "Good, because you've become important to me too." The next morning brought the first sign that Blackwood was done playing by rules. Dan rode out to check the north fence line and found 3 sections, cut as cattle scattered across open range. It took him and Carlos 2 days to round up the animals and repair the damage. 2 cows were missing, likely stolen or wandered too far to find. "This is deliberate," Carlos said, examining the cut wire. "Clean cuts. Someone with tools did this." "Blackwood's men." Dan's jaw tightened. "He's trying to provoke me." "What do we do?" "Fix the fence, find the cattle. Don't give him what he wants." Dan mounted his horse. "He wants me to confront him, to do something stupid. Violence would give him excuse to paint me as dangerous, unstable. We fight him in court, not with fists." But the harassment continued. A week later, someone poisoned the water source that fed his southern pasture. 3 more cattle died before Dan discovered the contamination. He had to dig a new well, backbreaking work that cost time and money he didn't have. Then Blackwood's men started following Carlos's wife when she went to town. Nothing overt, just presence. Intimidation. The message was clear: no one around Dan was safe. Frank Sullivan heard about the incidents and came to the ranch. "This is witness intimidation. We could bring charges." "Can we prove it?" Dan asked. "Probably not. Blackwood's too smart to get his own hands dirty." Frank's expression was grim. "He's trying to make you give up, to take whatever settlement he offers just to make it stop." "I don't settle." Dan's voice was granite. "He can burn my barn and kill my cattle. I'll rebuild. But I won't give him my father's land." Frank studied him for a long moment. "All right then. We prepare for war." The pre-trial hearing came in late October. The courthouse was a simple wooden structure, but inside it held the power to destroy lives. Judge Whitmore presided, his face professionally neutral. Blackwood sat with 2 lawyers, expensive suits, and leather briefcases, creating an impression of authority. Dan sat with Frank, feeling underdressed and outmatched. Blackwood's lead attorney was a man named Harrison, silver-haired and smooth. He argued with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case. "Your Honor, the law is clear. Without proper filing, without a final patent from the land office, Mr. Hartwell's claim is invalid. The land reverted to public domain, which my client has legitimately claimed." Frank stood to respond. "Your Honor, the Homestead Act's purpose was to reward those who worked the land, who made it productive. Mr. Hartwell has done exactly that. 6 years of continuous residence, over $3,000 in documented improvements, 500 head of cattle, a house, barns, fences. This is not an abandoned claim. This is a working ranch built by a man and his father before him." "But without proper filing," Harrison interrupted. "None of that matters. Law is not about intent, it's about compliance." Judge Whitmore held up a hand. "Gentlemen, I've heard enough. This case requires full trial. Too many questions of fact, too much complexity for summary judgment." He consulted a calendar. "Trial date is set for December 15th. Until then, Mr. Hartwell retains possession of the disputed property. Mr. Blackwood, your surveyors may access the land for legitimate assessment, but no interference with ranch operations." He banged the gavel. 6 weeks. Dan had 6 weeks to prepare for the fight of his life. The next weeks blurred together. Dan worked the ranch by day and prepared for trial by night. Frank brought him law books to read, cases to study. Dan learned terms like adverse possession and color of title and good faith occupancy. He learned that law was about precedent and interpretation, not just right and wrong. Sam sensed the tension and grew quieter. The boy did his chores without complaint, studied hard at school, tried to be invisible and helpful. One night, Dan found him sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep," Dan sat beside him. "Uncle Dan, if we lose the ranch, where will we go?" The question gutted him. Dan had been so focused on fighting, he hadn't prepared Sam for the possibility of loss. "We're not going to lose." "But if we do," Sam's voice was small, scared. Dan put an arm around the boy's thin shoulders. "Honestly, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. We're Hartwells. We survive." "I'm scared." "Me too, son." Dan tightened his grip. "But being scared doesn't mean we're weak. It means we understand what we're fighting for. Your grandfather was scared when he came west. I was scared every day of the war, but we faced it anyway." "Why, Buffalo?" "Because some things are worth being scared for. This land, this home, you, those are worth any fear." Dan looked at his nephew. I need you to be brave a little longer. Can you do that? Sam nodded, his jaw set in that stubborn Hartwell way. I can help. I'll testify in court if you need me. Pride swelled in Dan's chest. You're a good boy, Sam. Better than I deserve. Maggie continued to help organizing documents and typing statements. The pretense of propriety had worn thin. Dan visited her at the boarding house regularly now, and tongues wagged in Silverton. Let them talk. He'd found someone who understood him, who fought beside him without being asked. That mattered more than scandal. One Sunday afternoon in November, sitting in Mrs. Wilcox's parlor, Maggie asked the question Dan had been avoiding. What if you lose Dan? Really, what will you do? He'd been staring at the fire, watching flames consume wood the way Blackwood wanted to consume his ranch. Start over, I suppose. Take Sam somewhere else. Find work. Build again. That's not a plan, that's surrender. What else is there? Dan's frustration broke through. I can lose everything I've built, everything my father died for because of paperwork I didn't file. What kind of justice is that? The legal kind. Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. Which is why we're going to win. Because you have justice on your side even if the law is complicated. And if justice isn't enough. She reached for his hand. Then you have me. You have Sam. You have Carlos and Ruth and everyone who's seen what you've built, who you are. That doesn't disappear with a court ruling. Something in Dan's chest, something that had been clenched tight since Blackwood's threat, began to loosen. I'm not good at this, at needing people, at letting them help. I know, Maggie smiled. It's one of your more frustrating qualities. But you're learning. Maggie, I need to tell you something. Dan's throat felt tight. After the trial, whether I win or lose, I want to court you properly. With intent. Marriage intent. She didn't look surprised. Why tell me now? Because I realized something during the mine disaster. Life's too short and too uncertain to waste time. The ranch is important, but it's not everything. He met her eyes. You are. You and Sam, and having people who matter. I can rebuild a ranch, but I can't rebuild time lost. What if you lose everything? Then we start fresh together, if you'll have me. Maggie's eyes glistened. Dan Hartwell, you're facing losing your home, and you're proposing. I'm saying that home is people, not places, and I want you to be my home. She kissed him, then breaking every rule Mrs. Wilcox had set. It was brief, but sure, a promise made without words. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Win or lose, yes. Thanksgiving came cold and clear. The community celebration filled the church hall with the smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie. Dan brought Sam and they sat with Maggie at one of the long tables. Around them, Silverton gathered, grateful for another year survived in this hard country. Blackwood was there too, holding court near the front. He saw Dan and raised a glass in mock salute. Dan ignored him, focusing instead on Sam's excitement over the feast, on Maggie's warmth beside him. After dinner, as families mingled, Blackwood approached. Dan felt Carlos tense beside him, ready to intervene if needed. Hartwell, let's settle this like businessmen. Blackwood's voice carried drawing attention. I'll buy your cattle and equipment. Fair price, you can walk away with something instead of nothing. Dan set down his coffee cup carefully. No. I'm being generous. After you lose in court, you'll get nothing. This way you leave with dignity. Some things aren't for sale. Dan stood, meeting Blackwood's eyes. Honor, legacy, home. Those don't have prices. Pride goes before a fall, Hartwell. Then I'll fall with my pride intact. Dan's voice was quiet, but it carried. But I won't fall easy, and I won't fall without a fight. See you in court, Blackwood. The watching crowd murmured approval. Dan saw the respect in their faces, saw them choosing sides. Blackwood had money and power, but Dan had something more valuable. He had community. December brought snow and the approaching trial date. Frank arrived with concerning news. Dan, we have a problem. Dr. Peterson suffered a stroke. He's alive but can't speak clearly. He won't be able to testify. Dan felt the ground shift. Dr. Peterson was their key witness to the early days to Thomas Hartwell's original claim and intent. Without him, a crucial piece of their case vanished. Coincidence? Carlos asked darkly. Can't prove otherwise, Frank admitted. The doctor's old. These things happen. But Dan wondered, Blackwood's harassment had been escalating. Was this natural or engineered? He'd never know. What mattered was adapting. "What are our chances without Peterson?" he asked. Frank hesitated. "Still good, but it hurts. He was going to testify that your father explicitly intended the land for you, that the incomplete paperwork was due to illness, not abandonment. Without him, we rely more on circumstantial evidence. Then we make the circumstantial evidence stronger." They worked through December, refining their case. Frank drilled Dan on testimony, teaching him to answer precisely, to volunteer nothing, to stay calm under cross-examination. They practiced for hours, Frank playing Blackwood's lawyer, attacking from every angle. The school Christmas pageant provided a brief respite from stress. Sam played Daniel in the lion's den, a choice that made Dan's throat tight. The boy stood on stage and recited. Daniel faced the lions with faith, not fear. He trusted that truth would prevail, that righteousness would be his shield. Sam looked directly at Dan during the lines, his young face serious. The message was clear. The boy believed in him, trusted him, needed him to be brave. After the pageant, Dan found Sam backstage. "You did good tonight." "I meant it, Uncle Dan, what I said. About faith and truth." Sam gripped his hand. "You're going to win because you're right. That's not always how it works, son. But it should be, and you taught me to fight for how things should be, not just to accept how they are." Out of the mouths of children, Dan pulled Sam into a hug, his eyes burning. "Yeah, I did teach you that, didn't I?" The night before trial, Dan couldn't sleep. He walked his property with a lantern touching fence posts he'd hammered, running his hand along barn walls he'd raised. Every board, every nail, every stone represented hours of his life. Sweat and blood and stubborn determination poured into making something from nothing. His father had started this. Dan had continued it. Sam would finish it if Dan could hold on long enough. Carlos found him near the north pasture. "Amigo, you need rest. Tomorrow is important." "Can't rest, too much at stake." "Whatever happens, you fought with honor." Carlos's scarred face was kind in the lamplight. "That matters. Honor doesn't keep a roof over Sam's head." "No, but it makes you a man worth following. That's why we fight for you, not for land, for you." Dan looked at his foreman, his friend, this man who'd followed him from war to wilderness. "Thank you, Carlos, for everything. Save your thanks until we win." December 15th dawned gray and cold. Dan dressed in his only suit, the one he'd worn at his father's funeral. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw Thomas Hartwell staring back. Same stubborn jaw, same hard eyes, same refusal to quit. "All right, old man," he said to the reflection. "Let's finish what you started." The courthouse was packed. Word had spread through Silverton. This wasn't just about one man's ranch anymore. It had become a symbol. Could a working man stand against money and power? Could sweat equity count as much as legal paperwork? Everyone wanted to know. Judge Whitmore entered, and the room stood. He was in his 60s, white-haired and solemn. A fair man, people said, but also cautious. He wouldn't want to make waves. Blackwood sat at the plaintiff's table with his two lawyers, confident and relaxed. Dan sat with Frank, trying to project calm he didn't feel. "All rise for the case of Blackwood versus Hartwell land dispute." It had begun. Blackwood's lawyer, Harrison, delivered his opening statement with practiced ease. "Your Honor, this case is simple. The law requires proper filing for homestead claims. Mr. Hartwell's father failed to complete this filing before his death. Mr. Hartwell himself failed to complete it for 6 subsequent years. Without proper title, the land is public domain. My client has filed a legitimate claim on public domain land. That is his right. That is the law." Frank stood for Dan's side. "Your Honor, the Homestead Act exists to reward those who work the land, who turn wilderness into productivity. The Hartwell family has done exactly that. Thomas Hartwell claimed this land in 1870 and began improvements. His death in 1870 prevented completion of paperwork, but his son Daniel continued his work in good faith. 9 years of continuous Hartwell family occupation. Over $3,000 in documented improvements. This is not abandoned land. This is a working ranch built by 2 generations of one family. The law must serve justice, not just paperwork." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Proceed with evidence." The prosecution went first. Harrison called a land office clerk who testified that no final patent had been issued for Thomas Hartwell's claim. He called a surveyor clearly paid by Blackwood who minimized Dan's improvements. Adequate for basic ranching, but nothing exceptional. I've seen better. Frank's cross-examination was surgical. Did you count the cattle on the property? No, but the claim was about improvements to land, not livestock. Did you measure the house? 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, 2,000 square feet. The surveyor shifted. I estimated the size. Did you inspect the barn, the corrals, the fences? Did you examine receipts showing $3,000 invested? I did a visual survey. So your testimony is based on a brief visual inspection, not detailed measurement or documentation. Well, yes, but I'm experienced in evaluating land. No further questions. Frank sat down, having successfully painted the surveyor as cursory and biased. The mining engineer Blackwood called next argued that the land was better suited for mineral rights exploration than ranching. Frank demolished that quickly. This land has supported 500 head of cattle for 3 years. How is it unsuitable for ranching? It could be used more profitably for mining. That wasn't the question. Is it suitable for ranching, yes or no? It's adequate. Thank you. Then it was Dan's turn to present his case. Carlos testified first, describing in detail every building Dan had constructed, every improvement made. He brought receipts, photographs, detailed accounts of 6 years of labor. Ruth followed, providing years of supply records that proved Dan's continuous presence. She was folksy and honest, and the judge clearly liked her. Maggie testified about the timeline she'd created, about the organized evidence of continuous improvement. She was articulate and credible, and Harrison barely challenged her on cross-examination. Then Sam took the stand. The boy was nervous but determined. Frank led him gently. Sam, how long have you lived at the ranch? A year, sir, since my father died. And what's it like there? Sam's face lit up. It's home. Uncle Dan taught me everything. How to ride, how to mend fence, how to care for cattle. He reads to me at night from my grandfather's books. He makes sure I go to school. He's building something for our family, for our future. Harrison had the sense not to cross-examine a child. Sam stepped down and Dan met his eyes. The boy had done well. Finally, Frank called Dan to the stand. This was the moment everything balanced on. Dan swore to tell the truth and sat down, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom. Frank led him through the basics. When he'd arrived in Montana, how he'd found his father's claim, what he'd built. Mr. Hartwell, why didn't you complete the land office paperwork? Dan took a breath. Ignorance. I thought living on the land, improving it, working it for 6 years made it mine. I was wrong. I should have filed properly. That's on me. But you never abandoned the claim. Never. I've been there every day for 6 years. Built everything with my own hands. Invested everything I had. Then Harrison stood for cross-examination. His smile was shark-like. Mr. Hartwell, you admit you failed to file proper paperwork. I do. You admit you were negligent in completing your father's claim. I admit I made a mistake. A mistake that invalidates your claim to the land. A mistake that doesn't change 6 years of sweat and sacrifice. But legally, your claim is invalid, correct? Dan met Harrison's eyes. I'm not a lawyer. You tell me. I'm asking you. Then my answer is this. I don't know if my claim is legally valid. That's for the judge to decide. But I know it's morally valid. I know I earned that land with my blood, my father's blood, 6 years of work that would break most men. Paper says I don't own it, fine. But ask anyone in this town who that land belongs to. Ask them who built it, who worked it, who will die defending it. Your feelings don't change the law, Mr. Hartwell. And the law shouldn't punish a man for honest work honestly done. Harrison pressed harder, trying to rattle him, but Dan had faced Confederate artillery. A lawyer's words couldn't shake him. He answered each question steadily, admitting his mistakes but never wavering on the core truth. The land was his, not by paper but by every measure that mattered. Finally, Harrison stepped back. No further questions. Frank stood for redirect. Mr. Hartwell, one last question. If you lose this case, what will you do? Dan looked at Sam, sitting in the gallery, at Maggie, at Carlos and Ruth. I'll accept the court's judgment, but I'll know I fought for what's right, and I'll start over. Because that's what Hartwells do. We build. We don't quit. After all, witnesses had testified. Judge Whitmore called for closing arguments. Harrison went first. Your Honor's sympathy is not law. Mr. Hartwell's story is admirable, but the law requires compliance, not effort. Without proper filing, his claim fails. My client has filed properly. The decision is clear. Frank stood. Your Honor, the law serves justice. The Homestead Act's purpose was to reward those who made land productive. The Hartwells did that. 9 years of family occupation, substantial documented improvements. A working ranch that employs people, contributes to the community, represents everything the Homestead Act was meant to encourage. Yes, paperwork was incomplete, but does that erase 9 years of honest work? Does that justify allowing a wealthy man to steal what a poor man built? The law must have a heart. I ask you to give it one. Judge Whitmore looked at both sides. This is a complex case. I need time to review the law and evidence carefully. I'll issue my ruling on December 20th. Court is adjourned. 5 days. Dan had 5 days to wait. He walked out of the courthouse into cold December air, feeling hollowed out. He'd given everything he had. Now it was in the judge's hands. Maggie found him on the courthouse steps. You were magnificent. I was desperate. You were honest. That matters. She took his hand, not caring who saw. Whatever happens, we face it together. Sam hugged him fiercely. Carlos gripped his shoulder. Ruth pressed a basket of food into his hands. For the wait, she said, you need to eat. Blackwood emerged from the courthouse, saw the group surrounding Dan, and his smile faded. He'd expected isolation. Instead, he saw community. Dan met his eyes across the steps. Neither man spoke. But the message was clear. Whatever the judge ruled, Dan had already won something Blackwood would never have. He had people who stood with him, not for profit, but for principle. The 5 days stretched like years. Dan tried to work but couldn't focus. He tried to sleep but lay awake staring at ceilings. Frank visited daily with reassuring words that didn't reassure. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. On the morning of December 20th, Dan rode to town through fresh snow. The courthouse looked like a judge itself, stern and unforgiving. Inside the gallery filled quickly. This verdict would reverberate beyond one ranch. Judge Whitmore entered at exactly 9 o'clock. His face revealed nothing. I've reviewed the law extensively, he began. This is indeed a difficult case. Both parties have legitimate arguments. Dan's heart hammered. Get to it, he thought. Just tell me. The Homestead Act requires proof of continuous residence. The evidence clearly shows this was satisfied. It requires proof of improvement. Again, satisfied beyond question. $3,000 documented substantially more in undocumented labor. But it also requires proper filing. Here, Mr. Hartwell failed. Dan felt the world tilting. However, Whitmore continued, I must also consider equity. The doctrine of adverse possession exists precisely for situations like this, where a good faith occupant substantially improves land over time. The law recognizes their claim even without perfect paperwork. Hope flickered. Mr. Hartwell admitted his mistake. That honesty matters. He never abandoned the claim. He continued his father's work in good faith. The question is whether 7 years of adverse possession is met. Mr. Hartwell has been on the land 6 years, but his father filed the original claim in 1867. Combined, that's 9 years of continuous Hartwell family occupation. Whitmore paused, and the silence was absolute. Furthermore, the purpose of law is justice. Mr. Blackwood's claim, while technically proper, is an attempt to profit from another man's mistake. The law should not reward such opportunism. Dan couldn't breathe. Therefore, I rule in favor of Daniel Hartwell. His claim to the land is valid under adverse possession doctrine, combined with his father's original filing and his own substantial improvements. He is granted 90 days to complete proper filing with the land office. Mr. Blackwood's claim is denied. The courtroom erupted. Dan sat stunned as Frank grabbed his hand, shaking it vigorously. Sam was crying, Maggie was laughing. Carlos shouted something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. Dan stood on shaking legs and looked at the judge. Thank you, Your Honor. Whitmore nodded. Don't thank me. Thank your father for starting what you finished. Now go complete that paperwork. Blackwood stormed out, his lawyers trailing. At the door, he turned back. This isn't over, Hartwell. Dan met his glare. Yes, it is. Outside, the town celebrated. People Dan barely knew shook his hand. Miners he'd saved from the disaster clapped his shoulders. Ruth was crying into her apron. Even Mrs. Wilcox allowed herself a smile. But Dan knew the truth. He'd won the legal battle. But his ranch was damaged from Blackwood's harassment. His savings were depleted from legal fees. Winter was coming and he had cattle to feed with a poisoned water source and cut fences. He'd won the right to keep his land. Now he had to figure out how to survive on it. That night back at the ranch, Dan stood on his porch and looked at his kingdom. 500 head of cattle in a valley ringed by mountains. A house his father started and he finished. A boy who needed raising. A woman who'd agreed to share his future. He'd won. But the hardest part he suspected was just beginning. The legacy victory tasted like ash in Dan's mouth. He'd won the legal battle on December 20th, but the ranch still bore the scars of Blackwood's campaign. 3 sections of fence remained unrepaired. The poisoned water source meant hauling from the creek daily, backbreaking work in winter. 2 cattle were still missing. And the legal fees, even with Frank's generosity, had drained savings Dan needed for spring operations. The week before Christmas brought no respite. Carlos reported that someone had been watching the ranch from the tree line. Dan saw the tracks himself, boot prints in fresh snow, always keeping distance but maintaining surveillance. Blackwood might have lost in court, but he hadn't accepted defeat. On the evening of December 23rd, Dan sat at his kitchen table reviewing finances by lamplight. The numbers didn't lie. After paying Frank and covering damages from Blackwood's harassment, he had maybe $200 left. Spring calving was 2 months away. He needed to buy feed repair equipment, hire seasonal hands. $200 wouldn't cover half of it. Sam was asleep upstairs. Carlos had gone home to his family. The house felt empty despite its size, echoing with the weight of responsibility. Dan had fought so hard to keep this land. Now he might lose it anyway, not to lawyers' but to simple economics. He was considering selling breeding stock, a desperate move that would cripple future operations when he smelled smoke. At first he thought it was the fireplace. Then he realized the smell was wrong. Not wood smoke, something chemical. Coal oil. Dan was moving before a conscious thought finished. He grabbed his rifle from above the door and ran outside. The barn was burning. Flames climbed the eastern wall, fed by something that made them burn hot and fast. In the corral, horses screamed and kicked at the fence. Cattle in the nearby pasture bellowed their panic, visible even in darkness. "Carlos!" Dan shouted, knowing his foreman's cabin was too far to hear. "Sam, get out here!" He ran to the barn, heat hitting him like a physical force. The main doors were blocked by fire. He circled to the side entrance, yanking it open. Smoke poured out thick and choking. Inside, he could hear animals thrashing. 3 horses were stalled inside. 2 pregnant cows he'd been monitoring. Equipment worth hundreds of dollars. And his father's saddle, the one Thomas Hartwell had carried through the war, the one Dan had learned to ride on as a boy. The smoke was too thick to see. Dan dropped low, covering his mouth with his shirt. The heat was intense, singeing his eyebrows, making his skin feel like it was melting. He found the first horse by sound, a mare wild with fear. He grabbed her halter and pulled, fighting her panic and his own. Outside, Sam appeared in his nightshirt. "Uncle Dan, what's happening?" "Pump water." Dan shoved the mare toward the boy. "Get her away from the barn, then pump every bucket you can." He went back in. The second horse was easier, already near the door. The third was trapped in the back stall, flames between them. Dan had seconds to decide. The structure was failing. He could hear beams cracking overhead. He took a breath of relatively clean air and sprinted through the flames. Heat seared his left arm. He felt his shirt catch fire but ignored it. The horse was a young stallion, valuable breeding stock. Dan got the stall open, slapped the animal hard on the rump. The horse bolted toward light, toward safety. The pregnant cows were next. They were slower, more stubborn. Dan got one moving, but the second wouldn't budge. A beam fell 10 feet away, showering sparks. The roof was going. Carlos appeared like a ghost through the smoke. "I've got her, get out!" Together, they pushed the reluctant cow toward the door. Dan's lungs burned. Every breath was agony. But they got the animal out seconds before the main roof support cracked with a sound like a cannon shot. "Out!" Carlos grabbed Dan's arm and pulled. They stumbled into open air as the barn roof collapsed inward with a roar. Flames shot 50 feet high, turning night to day. Dan stood bent over, coughing so hard he thought his ribs would crack. His left arm was badly burned, the skin already blistering, but he was alive. Sam ran up with a bucket of water. It was pathetically inadequate against the inferno, but the boy's effort mattered. Carlos took it and threw it on Dan's smoldering shirt. They saved the 3 horses. They saved the 2 pregnant cows. Dan had grabbed his father's saddle on his last trip out, throwing it clear. But the barn itself was lost. The structure his father had started and he had expanded, burned like a funeral pyre. Equipment, hay for the winter tools accumulated over 6 years, all of it consumed. Dan sank to his knees in the snow, watching his barn die. The physical pain from the burns was nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest. He'd won in court, and Blackwood had responded with fire. "Coal oil," Carlos said, appearing beside him. His face was blackened with soot. "I can smell it. This was arson. Can we prove it?" "No, but we know." Dawn was breaking when the fire finally burned itself out, leaving only smoking timbers and ash. Dr. Peterson recovered enough to make house calls again, though his speech remained slurred, arrived to treat Dan's burns. The old doctor worked in silence, his hands still skilled despite his stroke. "Bad," he finally managed. "But you'll heal." While Dan looked at the ruins. "Will it?" The morning brought more bad news. In the chaos of fighting, the fire fence rails had been knocked down. Some cattle had wandered off. A quick count showed Dan had lost at least 20 head, either fled or stolen in the confusion. At current prices, that was $400 money he absolutely couldn't afford to lose. Frank Sullivan rode out from town, having heard about the fire. He stood beside Dan, surveying the destruction. "Blackwood," he said simply. "Can't prove it. Everyone knows it." Frank's jaw was tight. "This is retaliation for the court loss." "So what do I do? Take him to court again? With what money? What proof?" Dan's voice was flat, exhausted. "He wins, Frank. Not in court, but here. He's destroyed me financially. The town won't stand for this. The town can't rebuild my barn." But Frank was wrong, and Dan was about to learn just how wrong. That afternoon, as Dan was salvaging what he could from the ruins, he heard wagons, multiple wagons coming up the road to his ranch. He straightened, hand going automatically to his rifle. If Blackwood was coming to gloat, Dan wasn't sure he could control himself. But it wasn't Blackwood. Ruth Morrison led a procession of nearly 30 wagons loaded with lumber, nails, tools, and supplies. Behind her came miners Dan had saved from the disaster, shopkeepers from Silverton, farmers from neighboring spreads, even men Dan barely knew. Mayor Whitmore climbed down from his wagon. "Heard you had a fire." Dan could only stare. "We're here to help rebuild," Ruth said simply. "Can't let Blackwood win." "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." She gestured to the wagons. Everyone donated what they could, lumber from Jenkins' store, nails from the smithy. Even Blackwood's miners contributed, though they did it quiet-like. Carlos appeared at Dan's shoulder. "Amigo, I think you should let them help." Dan's throat was too tight to speak. He managed a nod. What followed was frontier magic. 30 men working with the efficiency of a military operation. They cleared the burned debris by noon. By evening, the framework of a new barn stood skeletal against the winter sky. Women brought food. Children hauled small supplies. The entire community moved as one organism with a single purpose. Maggie arrived with Sam, both of them carrying baskets of bread. She found Dan directing a team raising a support beam, his burned arm bandaged but still working. "You should be resting," she scolded. "Can't rest. My barn." "Their barn now, too." She gestured at the crowd. "Look at them, Dan. This is what you build. Not just wood and nails, community, people who stand together." He watched a miner he'd pulled from the collapsed shaft working beside a farmer whose son Sam tutored. 2 men who'd never spoken before, united in rebuilding what malice had destroyed. "I don't deserve this," Dan said quietly. "You saved 17 men from that mine. You stood up to Blackwood when others were afraid. You fight for what's right." Maggie took his good hand. "That's exactly what deserves this." By sunset on December 24th, the barn stood complete, not as large as the original, but solid and weatherproof. Men who'd worked all day refused payment, refused thanks, just clapped Dan's shoulder and went home to their families. Ruth was the last to leave. She pressed an envelope into Dan's hand. From folks in town, for feed and to replace the cattle you lost. Dan opened it, $300 in bills and coins. I can't take this. You can and you will. Ruth's voice was firm. You think you're the only one Blackwood's hurt? The only one who's been cheated or threatened? You stood up to him. You won. That matters to all of us. So you take this money and you use it to keep fighting. After she left, Dan stood alone in his new barn. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and hope. His father's saddle hung on the wall where it belonged. Around him, the structure hummed with the presence of everyone who'd built it. Not his barn anymore. Their barn. A community's answer to one man's cruelty. Carlos found him there an hour later. The men who watched from the tree line they left saw the whole town here and rode off. Blackwood's men. Who else? Carlos smiled. I think he got the message. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear. Dan woke to find Sam already up starting a fire in the kitchen stove. The boy was becoming capable, learning ranch skills that would serve him his whole life. Merry Christmas, Uncle Dan. Merry Christmas, son. They had a simple celebration. Carlos and his family joined them. Maggie came with Mrs. Wilcox's propriety, abandoned in favor of genuine feeling. They ate a meal of roasted chicken potatoes pie that Ruth had sent. Gifts were modest. Dan had carved Sam a wooden horse. Maggie gave him a set of books. Carlos's wife had knitted warm socks. After dinner, as the sun painted the mountains gold, Dan asked Maggie to walk with him. They bundled in coats and stepped outside, breath misting in the cold air. I need to ask you something, Dan said when they were alone, and I need you to think hard before answering. All right. He pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. I have nothing right now. Barn's rebuilt, but my savings are gone. I've got debt-damaged land and winter to survive. I can't promise you comfort or ease or any of the things a husband should provide. Dan, but I can promise you this. I'll work harder than any man alive to build something good. I'll protect you and any children we have with my last breath. I'll be faithful and honest and true. He opened the box. I'm asking you to marry me, Maggie, to build this life together, to be my partner in all things. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. You think I came to Montana seeking comfort. I came seeking purpose, meaning, a place where my work mattered. She took his face in her hands. I found all that, and I found you. So yes, Dan Hartwell, yes, I'll marry you. The ring fit perfectly. Dan kissed her as the sun set behind them. The ranch spread out before them like a promise. They'd survived Blackwood. They'd survived fire and legal battles and harassment. They could survive anything together. The wedding took place in early April when the first wildflowers dotted the meadows and the cattle had safely calved. The whole town attended, cramming into the small church until people spilled out the doors. Dan stood at the altar in his good suit, watching Maggie walk toward him on Mayor Whitmore's arm. She was beautiful in a simple white dress Mrs. Wilcox had helped her make. Her hair was loose the way Dan preferred it. She smiled at him and he felt his chest expand with something too large for words. The ceremony was traditional. They exchanged vows that promised forever. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Dan kissed her with the reverence due a miracle. Because that's what this was. A miracle that this woman, educated and refined, had chosen a broken soldier with calloused hands and an uncertain future. The celebration afterward filled Ruth's cafe and spilled into the street. There was music and dancing and more food than Dan had seen in years. Blackwood was notably absent, having sold his mining interests and left Montana entirely. Good riddance. As evening fell, Dan and Maggie departed in a wagon decorated with wildflowers. Sam rode with them because he was family, now part of the life they were building. The 5-mile ride to the ranch passed in easy conversation, all three of them relaxed and happy. The ranch house glowed with lamplight when they arrived. Carlos had lit fires in every room, a wedding gift of warmth. Dan carried Maggie across the threshold as tradition demanded, her laughter bright in the quiet house. Welcome home, Mrs. Hartwell. Feels like I've been coming home to this place my whole life, she said. I just didn't know it until now. They gave Sam the room at the end of the hall, the one with windows facing east to catch morning sun. Then Dan showed Maggie their room, the master bedroom with the large bed and the quilt Mrs. Wilcox had made. For a moment, awkwardness descended. They were married now, but still learning each other. Dan saw Maggie's uncertainty and took her hand. "We don't have to rush anything," he said quietly. "We have time." She smiled. "I know, but I don't want to wait. I've waited long enough for a real life to begin." Their wedding night was tender and tentative, and perfect in its imperfection. Two people learning how to be one, building intimacy the way they'd built everything else, with patience and care and commitment. The months that followed established the rhythm of their new life. Maggie continued teaching 3 days a week Dan, driving her to town and back. The rest of the time she worked the ranch alongside him, learning skills no Boston finishing school had taught. She proved capable with horses, gentle with newborn calves, and surprisingly good at keeping books. Carlos taught her to shoot, essential skill for ranch life. Dan taught her to read weather, to spot cattle illness, to judge grass quality. She absorbed it all with the same sharp intelligence she brought to everything. Summer brought the hard work of haying. Maggie worked beside the men shocking hay under brutal sun. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her skin darkened despite her bonnet. She became lean and strong, transformed by labor into someone who belonged to this land. One evening in early June, as they sat on the porch watching sunset, Maggie took Dan's hand and placed it on her belly. "Feel that?" she asked softly. Dan felt nothing at first, then a tiny flutter beneath his palm. His eyes widened. "Is that our baby, due in early spring?" The news struck Dan speechless. A baby, his child, the next generation of Hartwells, to work this land, to carry forward what his father had started and he had defended. "We need names," Maggie said, watching his face. "If it's a girl, I thought Ruth, after the woman who brought us together. And if it's a boy," Dan's voice was rough with emotion, "Thomas, after your father." Dan pulled her close, his face buried in her hair. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for being here, for choosing this life, for giving me more than I deserved." "You deserve everything good, Dan Hartwell. Don't ever doubt that." Winter came early that year. By February, snow lay 3 feet deep and the temperature dropped below zero. Maggie grew larger, moving with the careful grace of late pregnancy. Dr. Peterson visited regularly, monitoring her progress with his skilled but shaking hands. "Everything looks good," he said after one examination. "But be prepared. First babies can be difficult." Dan didn't like the way he said it, the warning hidden in his words. But Maggie seemed unconcerned, knitting tiny clothes and preparing the nursery with Sam's enthusiastic help. March 15th arrived with a late winter storm. Snow fell heavy and wet, the kind that collapsed roofs and trapped livestock. Dan was in the barn with Carlos, checking on a sick cow, when Sam burst in. "Uncle Dan, it's Aunt Maggie. The baby's coming." They ran to the house. Maggie was in the kitchen, doubled over and gripping the table. Her face was pale, her breathing sharp. "How long?" Dan demanded. "Started an hour ago. Didn't want to worry you." She gasped as another contraction hit. "But they're close now, very close." Dan sent Sam to fetch Dr. Peterson and Carlos's wife Maria, who'd assisted with births before. Then he helped Maggie upstairs, his heart hammering with fear he couldn't show. The labor progressed through the afternoon and into evening. Dr. Peterson arrived and examined Maggie with gentle efficiency. His face grew grave. "The baby's breech," he said quietly to Dan in the hallway. "Turned wrong. I can try to turn it, but..." "But what?" "It's dangerous, for both of them. If I can't turn the baby, if it gets stuck..." The old doctor's hands trembled. "You need to prepare yourself, Dan." "Prepare for what?" "For the possibility that you might have to choose between her and the child." Dan felt the floor tilt. "Don't ask me that. Don't you dare ask me that." "I'm not asking. I'm warning. These things happen, and when they do, someone has to decide." Through the door, Dan could hear Maggie crying out. The sound cut him worse than any wound he'd taken in the war. He pushed past Dr. Peterson and went to her. She was in the bed they'd shared for less than a year, her face slick with sweat, her hands gripping the sheets until her knuckles were white. When she saw Dan, she tried to smile. "Not exactly how I planned this," she gasped. "You're doing fine." Dan took her hand, let her squeeze until his bones creaked. "Better than fine." Another contraction racked her body. Dan watched helplessly as pain consumed her. This was worse than any battle. In war, he could fight back. Here, he could only witness suffering he couldn't prevent. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Maggie grew weaker with each contraction, her cries softer, more desperate. Dr. Peterson tried twice to turn the baby. Both times failed. Maria brought water and clean linens, her face professionally calm, but her eyes worried. At 4 in the morning, Dr. Peterson pulled Dan aside again. I need to try one more time to turn this baby. But if it doesn't work, the child will suffocate in the birth canal. And Maggie doesn't have much strength left. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to tell me your choice, if it comes to it, her or the child. Dan looked at Maggie, at this woman who'd chosen him when she could have had anyone, who'd left Boston comfort for Montana hardship, who'd stood beside him through legal battles and barn fires and every crisis life had thrown at them. Save Maggie, he said hoarsely. Whatever it takes, save her. What if she wants me to save the baby? She doesn't get a choice. I do, and I choose her. Dan's voice cracked. I can live without a child. I can't live without her. Dr. Peterson nodded and returned to the bedroom. Dan stood in the hallway listening to Maggie's weakening cries and prayed harder than he'd ever prayed in his life. Inside the room, Dr. Peterson made one final attempt to turn the baby. Dan heard him giving quiet instructions to Maria, heard Maggie scream, heard Dr. Peterson curse. Then incredibly a different sound, the thin, angry wail of a newborn. Dan burst through the door. Dr. Peterson was holding a tiny blood-covered infant. Maggie lay pale and still on the bed, so still that terror gripped Dan's heart. Maggie, her eyes fluttered open. Dan, the baby. A boy, Dr. Peterson said, his voice shaking with relief. A healthy boy, and your wife will recover. Barely, but she will. Dan couldn't speak. He could only watch as Maria cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft cloth. Dr. Peterson laid the infant in Maggie's arms, and she looked down at their son with wonder. Thomas, she whispered. Thomas Daniel Hartwell. The baby had Dan's blue eyes and Maggie's delicate features. He was perfect and terrifying and more precious than anything Dan had ever held. Sam crept into the room, his face awed. Is that my cousin, your brother? Dan corrected, pulling the boy close. Family isn't just blood, it's choice, and we choose you. Dr. Peterson packed his instruments with shaking hands. That was close. Too close. Another hour and we'd have lost them both. But they hadn't lost them. Against odds and luck and everything that could go wrong, his family had survived. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry. Maggie recovered slowly, regaining strength day by day. Baby Thomas proved to have healthy lungs and an appetite that kept Maggie exhausted. Dan did what he could, changing diapers and walking the floor, when the baby cried, learning fatherhood the way he'd learned everything else through trial and error. Spring came with a rush of green. The cattle thrived. The new barn stood solid. Dan completed the land office paperwork finally and officially making the ranch his. 9 years after his father's death, the Hartwell claim was legal and unassailable. One evening in June, Dan stood on his porch holding his son while Maggie and Sam prepared dinner inside. The ranch stretched before him, golden in the dying light. 500 head of cattle grazed peacefully. The house and barn stood strong. Fences ran straight and true to the horizon. His father had started this with nothing but a dream and a homestead claim. Dan had continued it through war and hardship and legal battles. Now, Thomas Daniel Hartwell, third generation, would carry it forward. Your grandfather would be proud, Dan whispered to the sleeping infant. Hell, I'm proud. We built something that lasts, something worth fighting for. Maggie appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his. What are you thinking about legacy? How my father died to claim this land, how I almost lost it, how we almost lost each other. He looked at her. And how none of it means anything without family to share it. Your father left you more than land, Maggie said softly. He left you the example of a man who doesn't quit, who builds instead of destroys, who sacrifices for the future. That's the real inheritance. Dan pulled her close, careful not to crush the baby between them. I love you, both of you, all of you. He glanced through the window at Sam setting the table. This family, this life, it's more than I ever thought I'd have. You earned it, every acre, every moment. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, Dan thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a desperate rescue on a dusty boardwalk to this moment of peace and plenty. From a man alone to a man surrounded by family. The hunger that had once brought Maggie to her knees had been satisfied in ways neither of them could have imagined. Not just with food, but with purpose and belonging and love that transformed strangers into family hardship, into strength, and a piece of Montana wilderness into home. No regrets, Maggie asked, echoing a question from long ago. Dan looked at his wife, his son, his ranch, his life. Not one. Years later, when Thomas was old enough to understand, Dan would tell him the story. How his mother had fainted from hunger, and his father had carried her to safety. How they'd fought legal battles and barn fires, and every obstacle the frontier could throw at them. How community and courage and stubborn refusal to quit had built the Double H Ranch into something that would last generations. But tonight he simply stood and held his family and watched the sun set over the land that was finally legally, irrevocably his. Land that had cost him everything and given him more. Land soaked with his father's blood and his own sweat. Land he would pass to his son, who would pass it to his children, continuing the Hartwell legacy into a future Thomas had dreamed but never lived to see. The ranch had been saved. The family had been built. The legacy had been secured. And in the gathering darkness, with his wife beside him and his son in his arms, Dan Hartwell was finally completely home.